The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet, sleepy town of Riverton, casting long shadows across the peeling paint of the old houses. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets were rarely kept for long. But in a small, damp cottage at the end of Elm Street, there lived a woman named Alina, who was a mystery to almost everyone. Alina was in her late 60s. Though the deep lines on her face and the stoop in her shoulders made her seem much older, she was a tiny woman, thin as a dried twig, with hair the color of iron that she always pulled back into a severe, tight bun. She dressed the same way every single day, no matter the weather. A thick, oversized cardigan that had seen better decades. A long pleated skirt that dragged slightly on the ground, and scuffed black leather shoes. To the people in Riverton, she was just old Alina, a quiet woman who walked with a limp and kept her eyes glued to the sidewalk every afternoon. Rain or shine, Alina would walk to the local market. She moved slowly, her right leg dragging behind her just a little bit with every step. It was a painful, awkward gait that made it look like each movement was a struggle. The younger people in town often sped past her, their eyes glued to their phones, barely noticing her existence. The adults would offer a polite nod or a quick hello, but they rarely stopped to chat. There was something about her, a wall of silence she built around herself, that made people keep their distance. She was invisible. A background character in the busy movie of their lives, but if anyone had bothered to look closely, they would have seen that Alina's hands were always moving. Even when she was waiting in line at the grocery store, her fingers would be twitching and dancing against her thighs. It was a nervous habit, or so it seemed. Her fingers were long and bony, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but they possessed a strange, restless energy. She would tap out invisible rhythms on the handle of her shopping cart, a complex and silent beat that no one else could hear. Alina's life was a picture of loneliness. She lived in a house that was frozen in time. The furniture was old and covered in sheets to keep off the dust. The only room that looked lived in was a small sunroom at the back of the house. This was her sanctuary. In the center of the room, bathed in the pale afternoon light, stood a beautiful object that seemed completely out of place among the clutter. A sleek, black electronic keyboard. It was an old model, probably 30 years old, with yellowing keys and a small dusty screen, but Alina treated it like it was made of gold. However, there was something strange about the way she played it. She never turned the power on. The keyboard was silent. She would pull her creaky bench up to it, sit down with a heavy sigh, and place her swollen fingers gently on the cold plastic. Then she would close her eyes and begin to play. For hours. She would move her hands across the silent keys, pressing them down one by one, mimicking the motions of a master pianist. Her left hand would keep a steady, deep rhythm, while her right hand would dance across the high notes, playing trills and complicated chords that existed only in her mind. To a watcher, it might have looked like madness, an old woman lost in a fantasy. But for Alina, it was the only way she could survive. She was terrified of hearing a real note. She was terrified of the sound because it reminded her of everything she had lost decades ago. Before the limp, before the gray hair, Alina had been someone else entirely. She had been known as a prodigy. She could play music before she could read words. By the time she was 15, she had won every competition in the state. She had a scholarship to the best music school in the country and a future that shone as bright as the stage lights. She played with a passion that made people cry. Her sister, Anna, was her biggest fan. They were inseparable to girls with big dreams in a small world. But dreams are fragile. One rainy night, everything changed. It was a stupid, tragic accident. A car lost control on the wet pavement. Alina survived, but her sister did not. The crash had also crushed Alina's right hand. The doctors told her she would never play again. The pain in her hand eventually faded, but the pain in her heart never did. She blamed herself. She blamed her music. She felt that by chasing her dream, she had lost the only person who truly mattered. So, she made a vow. She locked her piano, she buried her talent, and she decided to disappear. She moved to Riverton to be alone. Punishing herself by being close to the music she loved, but refusing to let herself hear it. Years passed like slow, gray rivers. Alina grew old in her silence. Her husband, a kind but quiet man named Thomas, watched her fade away day by day. He knew the story. He knew about the accident, the guilt, and the talent she had suppressed. He had bought her the silent keyboard years ago, hoping it might help, but she never used it to make a sound. It was her way of remembering without suffering. Recently, however, Thomas had become very ill. The doctor said it was his heart. He was weak, spending most of his days in a recliner in the living room wrapped in blankets. He watched Alina shuffle back and forth, bringing him soup and medicine, her head hung low. It broke his heart to see her so defeated. He knew he didn't have much time left, and his only wish was to see her come alive again. Just one last time, one Tuesday afternoon. Alina came home from the market to find Thomas holding a brightly colored piece of paper. It was a flyer for the Riverton City Talent Showcase. It was a big event for the town, usually full of singing children and dance groups. Held in the high school auditorium, Alina, Thomas said, his voice raspy and weak. He held the paper out to her with a trembling hand. Alina looked at it, confused. "What is this, Thomas?" "I don't want to go watch a show." "You need to rest." "You aren't going to watch," he said, coughing slightly. "You are going to play." Alina stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. "Play, Thomas. Have you lost your mind?" "I can play. Not anymore. And besides, look at me. I'm an old woman. Who wants to see an old woman play the piano?" "I do," Thomas said softly. "And I think the world needs to see you too. You have kept this gift locked up for too long. It wasn't your fault, Alina. It never was." Alina felt a sharp pang in her chest. She looked at the flyer, then at her swollen, arthritic hands. The fear was instant and choking. The thought of touching a real piano that made noise, terrified her. It brought back the nightmares of the crash and the feeling of failure. "I can't," she whispered, turning away. "Please, don't ask me this." Thomas didn't argue. He just let the flyer drop onto the side table. He looked at her with sad, loving eyes that seemed to see right through her walls. "Just think about it," he whispered. For the next 2 days, Alina didn't sleep. The flyer sat on the table, mocking her. Every time she walked past it, she felt a pull. She remembered the feeling of the vibration of the strings under her fingers. She remembered the applause. She remembered Anna, finally, late on the second night. While Thomas slept fitfully in the other room, Alina picked up the phone. Her hand shook so badly she almost dropped the receiver. She dialed the number on the bottom of the flyer. "Hello?" "Yes, I would like to sign up for the talent show. My name is Alina." The voice on the other end was cheery and young. "Great, what are you going to do? Sing? Dance? Juggle?" "No," Alina said, her voice barely a whisper. "I play the piano." "Awesome. We have a great piano at the school." "You go on at 8 p.m. See you there." Alina hung up the phone. The room was silent. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She didn't know if she could do it. She didn't know if she could even press a key hard enough to make a sound, or if the pain would stop her. But she had made a promise to Thomas, and perhaps deep down, she wanted to know if the music was still there, buried under the years of silence. She took a deep breath, walked into the sunroom, and for the first time in 30 years, she turned on the electronic keyboard. A soft, digital beep filled the room. It was a terrible sound, but it was a start. The night of the talent showcase finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the Riverton High School auditorium was buzzing with a chaotic mix of excitement and nerves. The large room was packed, filled to the brim with parents holding video cameras, loud groups of teenagers and curious neighbors looking for a bit of weekend entertainment. The air smelled faintly of floor wax, popcorn, and the heavy scent of cheap perfume worn by the elderly ladies in the front row. Bright stage lights cut through the dimness of the hall, illuminating the heavy velvet curtains and the shiny black grand piano sitting center stage. Backstage, the reality of what she was about to do hit Alina like a physical blow. It was cramped and cluttered with music stands, tangled cables, and nervous performers pacing back and forth. Alina stood in a corner, clutching her worn canvas purse to her chest as if it were a shield. She felt incredibly small among the young dancers in their sparkly costumes and the guitar players tuning their instruments. She had chosen her best outfit, which wasn't saying much along. Dark skirt that she had ironed carefully, and a cream-colored blouse with a small stain near the collar that she hoped the lights would hide. Her cardigan was threadbare at the elbows, and her shoes were the same scuffed black ones. She wore to the grocery store. She peeked through the heavy red curtains at the side of the stage, her eyes scanning the crowd. It was a sea of faces, all talking, laughing, and looking at their phones. To Alina, it looked like a monster waiting to swallow her whole. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her ears, a rhythmic thumping that made it hard to catch her breath. She looked down at her right hand, flexing the fingers. They felt stiff and cold, like frozen sausages. The arthritis was acting up, a dull ache pulsing in her knuckles. How could she possibly play? The doubt was a heavy weight on her shoulders, whispering that she was foolish to think she could step back into the past. On the other side of the curtain, the show was moving along at a brisk pace. The host, a local radio announcer with a very loud voice and a shiny suit, was doing his best to keep the energy high. A group of young girls had just finished a dance routine to loud pop music, and the audience had clapped politely. The host walked back to the microphone, tapping it to get everyone's attention. "All right, folks, we have a special treat for you next," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. Sometimes talent isn't about how many followers you have online, or how flashy your costume is. Sometimes it's about pure, raw skill. Please welcome to the stage Alina. The host paused, looking around expectantly, but there was only a murmur of confusion from the crowd. The name didn't mean anything to them. From the side of the stage, Alina took her first step. Her leg dragged, her cane clicking loudly on the wooden floor. The sound of the cane echoed through the auditorium, cutting through the background noise. As she emerged from the shadows and into the bright spotlight, a hush fell over the crowd, followed immediately by a ripple of whispers. It wasn't the respectful silence of anticipation. It was the confused murmur of people wondering why an old woman was hobbling out onto a stage meant for pop stars. Alina walked slowly. Every step was a battle against her fear and the pain in her leg. The spotlight was blinding, making it impossible to see the audience, but she could feel them. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her. She felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope. She was painfully aware of her cardigan, her limp, and her gray hair. She felt like she didn't belong. In a world of youth and glamour, she was a relic. As she reached the piano bench, the whispers grew louder. A group of teenagers sitting in the third row pointed and giggled. One boy nudged his friend, laughing as Alina struggled to lower herself onto the high bench. Her joints creaked, and she had to use her arms to push herself up. It was not graceful. It was the clumsy movement of an elderly body that had seen too many hard years. "Is this a joke?" Someone whispered loudly from the mezzanine. The words floated down to the stage, stinging Alina's ears. Even the judges seemed unimpressed. Sitting at a long table to the right of the stage were three local figures: a business owner, music teacher from a neighboring town, and a cynical radio personality. The radio personality, a man known for his harsh words, leaned back in his chair and looked at his watch, letting out an audible sigh that was picked up by the microphones nearby. He twirled his pen in his fingers, looking bored already. The music teacher squinted at Alina, perhaps confused by the contrast between the grand piano and the woman sitting before it. Alina sat frozen on the bench. She adjusted the height, trying to find a comfortable position. But her hands were shaking so badly she fumbled with the lever. The teenagers giggled again. The sound was like sandpaper on her nerves. She felt a hot flush of shame rise up her neck. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to run back down the ramp and hide in her dark little cottage. She felt a wave of nausea. Why had she let Thomas talk her into this? She was about to humiliate herself in front of the entire town. She looked out into the darkness of the auditorium. She couldn't see Thomas, but she knew he was there, likely in a wheelchair near the back, struggling to stay awake. She had promised him. She closed her eyes for a brief second, imagining his tired smile. It gave her a tiny spark of courage, just enough to keep her seated. Elena reached out and lifted the heavy fallboard of the piano, revealing the black and white keys. They were shiny and perfect. For a moment, the sight of them took her breath away. It had been decades since she touched a real concert piano. The scent of the wood and the felt was intoxicating, bringing back a flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm her. The audience was getting restless. The coughing started. A baby cried somewhere in the back. The radio judge tapped his pen rhythmically on the table, a sign of impatience. The silence was stretching out too long. They were waiting for her to start, but mostly they were waiting for her to fail. To make a fool of herself so they could have something to talk about tomorrow. Elena placed her hands in her lap. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She could feel the sweat on her palms. She looked at her right hand, the hand that had been crushed and rebuilt. The hand that she thought had forgotten how to sing. The knuckles were swollen, red, and stiff. She tried to wiggle her fingers, and a sharp pain shot through her wrist. She grimaced. The radio judge rolled his eyes at the grimace, assuming she was just confused or senile. "Come on, Grandma," he muttered under his breath. Though the microphone didn't quite catch it this time, Elena blocked them out. She blocked out the giggling teenagers, the impatient judge, the whispers about her clothes. She focused entirely on the ivory keys in front of her. She knew the piece she had chosen. It was a song she had played 1,000 times in her dreams. It was a song of love and loss, a song that matched the scars on her soul. She didn't know if her body could handle the technical demands, but she knew her heart had to try. She slowly raised her hands. The movement was slow and jerky. The audience watched, mesmerized by the sight of her trembling hands hovering over the keys. The teenager in the front row held his phone up, ready to record a video to post online, expecting to capture a fail moment that would get thousands of likes. The pressure in the room was immense. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the auditorium. Elena sat there, a statue of fear and determination, trapped in the glare of the lights while the town waited to mock her. She was at the edge of a cliff, and there was no turning back. She took one last breath, closed her eyes to shut out the cruel faces, and prepared to let the music speak for her. The silence in the auditorium was heavy and suffocating. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for a reason to laugh, to boo, or simply to leave. Elena sat frozen on the bench, her small body hunched over the massive grand piano. The bright stage lights made her eyes water, but she didn't wipe them. She could feel the sticky heat of her own fear, and her heart was hammering so hard against her ribs that she was sure the microphone would pick up the thumping sound. Her fingers hovered just inches above the keys, trembling violently. To the audience, it looked like frailty. They saw a broken old woman who was lost and confused. But inside, something else was happening. Elena was no longer in the high school auditorium. She had closed her eyes and mentally transported herself back to the sunroom of her cottage. She pictured Thomas sleeping in his chair, his chest rising and falling weakly. She remembered the promise she made to him. Then, deeper than that, she remembered the music. She remembered the feeling of the vibration traveling up her arms when she was a girl, the way the notes would float in the air like living things. She pushed out the sound of the teenagers whispering and the sighing judge. She pushed out the memory of the car crash and the pain in her leg. She focused everything she had left on the black and white keys beneath her fingertips. Then it happened. Her right hand dropped. It wasn't a gentle or tentative press. It was a strike. Her thumb hit the first note with a force that surprised everyone, including herself. A deep, resonant Imagra chord filled the hall. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical presence. The vibration shook through the floorboards and up into the benches where the audience sat. The quality of the tone was rich and warm, cutting through the hum of the air conditioning like a knife through silk. The effect on the room was instantaneous. The giggling in the third row stopped abruptly. The teenager who had been holding up his phone to record a fail video lowered his hand, his eyes widening in surprise. The sound was too big, too confident to be ignored. It commanded respect. Before the shock of the first chord could fade, Elena's left hand joined in. She began to play Franz Liszt's Liebestraum No. 3, a piece famous for its sweeping melodies and deep emotion. Initially, the tempo was slow and rubato flexible and expressive. Alina played the opening melody with a tenderness that felt intimate. She wasn't just hitting notes, she was caressing them. She leaned into the piano, her face relaxing as the music took over. The trembling in her hands vanished, replaced by a mechanic precision that defied her age. The audience watched, transfixed. The cynical radio judge, who had been looking at his watch only moments ago, froze. His mouth opened slightly, and the pen he was twirling stopped in midair. He exchanged a glance with the music teacher next to him, whose eyebrows had shot up in disbelief. They both realized immediately that this was no amateur playing. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. As the melody continued, the music began to climb. It flowed like a river, gentle and mesmerizing. People in the back rows stopped talking. The parents who had been scrolling through their phones put them away, drawn in by the sound. There was a purity to the tone that felt out of place in a tacky high school talent show. It sounded like something from a grand concert hall in Vienna, not a small-town gymnasium. Elena's eyes remained closed. She saw the notes as colors in her mind. She felt the stiffness in her fingers melt away as the adrenaline surged through her veins. The arthritis that usually made her joints feel like rusty hinges seemed to disappear. Her right hand, the one that had been injured so long ago, moved with a fluid grace that seemed medically impossible. She played the intricate fingerings with ease, trilling up and down the keyboard with a speed that blurred the air. The mood of the piece began to shift. The gentle, dreamlike opening started to build in intensity. Elena's body began to sway with the music, a natural movement that she hadn't allowed herself in decades. Her cardigan sleeve brushed against the keys as she reached for the high notes, but she didn't care. The messy bun on her head started to loosen, and a stray gray hair fell over her face, but she didn't brush it away. She was completely lost in the song. Suddenly, the music entered a much harder section. The melody became more complex, requiring a balance between the booming bass notes in the left hand and the delicate singing high notes in the right. It was a technical challenge that would scare off most professional players. The teenagers in the front row, who were ready to mock a mistake, found themselves leaning forward. They didn't know anything about Liszt, but they knew skill when they saw it. They watched the old woman's hands dance across the keys, faster and faster. Alina attacked the keys with passion. She wasn't afraid to be loud anymore. She pressed the pedals with her heavy scuffed shoe, sustaining the sound until the entire room was vibrating with the music. The sound was overwhelming. It washed over the judges, making the radio judge drop his pen. It rolled over the crowd, silencing every cough and whisper. People who had come for a cheap laugh found themselves holding their breath without realizing why. The contrast was shocking. Just 5 minutes ago, this woman was a joke to them, a target for their boredom and cruelty. Now, she was a giant. She was commanding the room with a power that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with soul. The music was pouring out of her, a cascading waterfall of sound that was both beautiful and slightly sad. It felt like she was telling a story without words, a story of longing and love that everyone in the room, regardless of their age, could feel deep in their chest as the section reached its climax. Elena's hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur. She hit a series of octaves that rang out like church bells. The sound was so full and resonant that it seemed to bounce off the walls and ceiling. The lighting technician in the back booth stopped adjusting the spotlight and just stood there listening. He had seen hundreds of acts, but he had never heard anything like this. Alina felt a surge of energy she hadn't felt in years. The pain in her back, her leg, her hands had all faded into the background. She was young again in her mind, playing on the stage of her youth, before the accident, before the grief took over. She played with a fierce determination, as if this performance was her one chance to say everything she had been to, afraid to speak for 40 years. The audience was no longer a mob of strangers. They were united by the sound, captivated by the transformation unfolding before their eyes. The mockery was dead, killed by the sheer beauty of the music. The silence that had once been impatient and cruel was now a silence of awe. Everyone was waiting with bated breath to see where she would take them next. Elena's fingers flew across the ivory, guiding them through the storm of notes, leading them toward the emotional peak of the piece. She was no longer the shy old woman from the grocery store. She was a master, and the piano was her voice. As the music surged forward, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted from surprise to something much deeper. The piece Elena was playing was famous for its technical difficulty, but she wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to prove how fast her fingers could move. Instead, she was pouring every ounce of her soul into the instrument. The sound that filled the room was no longer just a performance. It was a confession. The intensity grew. The notes became a storm, cascading down the keyboard like heavy rain. Elena's body swayed with the force of the music, her thin frame almost lifting off the bench. Her face, usually so withdrawn and masked by age, transformed completely. Her eyes were squeezed tight, lines of concentration and deep emotion etching themselves across her forehead. To the people watching, it looked like she was in pain. But it wasn't physical pain. It was the kind of hurt that comes from holding things inside for too long. The teenagers in the front row, who had been ready to film a disaster just minutes ago, were now frozen. The boy with the phone had let his arm drop to his side, the screen dark. He wasn't thinking about likes or views anymore. He was staring at Elena's hands. He saw the swollen knuckles, the veins that stood out like blue ropes under her pale skin, and the sheer effort it took for her to control the keys. He realized with a sudden jolt that this wasn't an old woman wasting time. This was a warrior fighting a battle with a piano. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by a look of guilt and wonder. Even the cynical radio judge was completely undone. He sat slumped in his chair, his mouth slightly open. He had heard thousands of songs in his career. Perfect digital tracks and auto-tuned vocals, but none of them had the raw, jagged edge of what he was hearing now. This music wasn't clean. It was messy and human. It had cracks in it, just like Elena's voice, but those cracks were where the beauty lived. He felt a strange burning in his own eyes and reached up to rub them, confused by the sudden moisture. He looked at his pen on the table and felt ashamed of his impatience. The music reached a thunderous climax. Elena's hands were moving in a blur of motion, crashing down on the low keys with a power that vibrated through the floorboards of the old gymnasium. It was a sound of anger, of grief, of a heart breaking open. The heavy chords rang out like shouts in an empty cathedral. For a moment, the air in the room felt too thick to breathe. The audience didn't just hear the music. They felt it in their chests. A mother in the back row, who had been worrying about her bills all day, suddenly felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know why, but the music made her think of her own childhood, of things she had lost and forgotten. And then, as abruptly as the storm had begun, it broke. Elena's hands shifted. The roaring bass notes stopped. The crashing chords vanished. She transitioned into the final, heartbreakingly soft section of the piece. The change was jarring. The loudness was replaced by a delicate, whispering melody. It was so quiet that the audience had to lean forward to hear it. The silence between the notes became just as important as the notes themselves. Elena played these final bars with a tenderness that was almost painful to watch. Her fingers barely touched the keys, teasing the sound out of the strings. The melody was high and lonely, floating above the audience like a ghost. It was a sound of goodbye, of acceptance. She was remembering her sister. She was remembering the girl she used to be. With every gentle note, she was letting go of the guilt she had carried for 40 years. She was forgiving herself for surviving the crash. Tears were now streaming freely down Elena's face, but she didn't wipe them away. They dripped off her chin and onto the cardigan she had worried was stained. The makeup she had put on, just a little powder to hide her age, was streaked, but nobody cared. Everyone saw the tears, and somehow they made the music even more real. In the third row, the girl who had giggled at Elena's limp earlier was now crying too. She looked at her friend, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She realized now that the limp wasn't something to laugh at. It was a sign of a hard life. This woman had carried burdens that a teenager couldn't even imagine. The girl felt a hot flush of shame wash over her, and she reached out to squeeze her friend's hand, looking for comfort. The laughter was completely dead, replaced by a solemn, heavy silence. The music grew softer and softer. Alina was playing on pure instinct now. She wasn't counting beats or worrying about technique. She was following her heart. Her right hand played a final, shimmering run of notes that cascaded down like tears falling. Her left hand played the last 3 supporting chords. They were simple, deep, and resonant. Finally, her hands hovered over the keys for the last note. She pressed it down gently. She held her finger there, letting the sound fade into the air, sustaining it as long as possible. The note hung there, shimmering in the quiet room, slowly dying away. It seemed to echo off the walls, refusing to let go. Alina sat perfectly still, her head bowed, listening until the very last vibration of the string had disappeared into the wood. When she finally lifted her hands, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, but it wasn't bored anymore. It was a silence filled with the weight of what they had just heard. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. No one looked at their phones. 500 people sat in the dark, staring at the hunched figure of the old woman in the worn cardigan. The air in the room felt charged, like the moment after a lightning strike, when you wait for the thunder. Alina opened her eyes. The brightness of the stage lights stung her wet pupils. Slowly, the world came back into focus. She could see the edge of the piano, the dusty black lid, the keys she had just conquered. She could see her own hands resting in her lap, trembling again now that the adrenaline was fading. For a second, the fear returned. She looked up, squinting into the darkness beyond the footlights. She couldn't see their faces clearly. She expected them to be booing. She expected them to be whispering that it was a mistake. She was terrified that she had just made a fool of herself by letting her emotions take over. She gripped the sides of the bench, ready to stand up and shuffle away as quickly as she could. Desperate to escape the judgment she felt was coming. She felt small again, just an old lady with a limp and a torn skirt. The confidence the music had given her was draining away, leaving her exposed and cold. She sat there, frozen, waiting for the rejection she had feared for 40 years. Alina sat on the hard bench, her chest heaving, her hands trembling in her lap. The last echo of the piano note had dissolved into the air, leaving a heavy, absolute silence behind. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, terrified to open them. In her mind, she was back in that moment of weakness, expecting to hear Gier's laughter, or the polite but hollow clapping reserved for someone who tried but failed. She prepared herself for the humiliation of walking off the stage. While people checked their watches or whispered amongst themselves, she felt small, exposed, and incredibly foolish for thinking she could recapture the past. But then, sound broke through the silence. It wasn't a boo. It wasn't a whisper. It was the sharp sound of a single person standing up from a plastic seat near the front. Alina opened her eyes, blinking against the bright lights, and squinted into the darkness. It was the cynical radio judge. He was on his feet, ignoring his pen and his papers. He didn't clap politely. He slammed his hands together, a loud, rhythmic beat that echoed through the hall. Almost immediately, the music teacher next to him stood up as well. Then the business owner. The sound grew from a smattering of applause into a roar. It started in the front rows, where the shock of her performance was strongest, and then rippled outward, like a wave crashing through the entire auditorium. Within seconds, the audience was on its feet. 500 people were standing. The sound was deafening, a wall of noise that washed over the stage. It wasn't just clapping. People were cheering, shouting, and whistling. It was a chaotic, messy, and overwhelming sound of approval. Alina sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. She looked out at the sea of faces, now illuminated by the stage lights reflecting back at them. The teenagers who had mocked her limp were clapping enthusiastically, their faces flushed with excitement and maybe a hint of shame. The boy who held his phone was now recording her again, but this time with a look of awe on his face, capturing a moment he knew he would never forget. The mothers in the back were wiping tears from their eyes, clapping so hard their palms must have stung. The cynicism and the judgment that had filled the room only 10 minutes ago had vanished. In its place was a profound sense of connection. They weren't cheering for a pop star or a spectacle. They were cheering for the triumph of the human spirit. They were cheering for the old lady who had dared to be vulnerable, who had shown them that beauty and pain could coexist. They felt privileged to have witnessed it. Elena's eyes searched the crowd instinctively. She found him near the back, close to the exit ramp. Thomas was in his wheelchair, pushed up against the wall so he wouldn't block anyone's view. He was struggling to sit up straight, his face wet with tears. Even from this distance, she could see the pride radiating from him. He raised one trembling hand to give her a weak thumbs up. Elena let out a small, choked sob. She had done it. She had kept her promise. The host walked onto the stage. His usually confident smile replaced by a look of genuine reverence. He gestured for the crowd to quiet down. But it took a long time for the noise to subside. When it finally did, a hush fell over the room again, but this time it was a warm, comfortable silence. "Elena," the host said, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know what to say. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in this hall. Thank you. Lena didn't trust her voice enough to speak into the microphone. She simply nodded her head, a humble, slow gesture. She stood up from the bench, her legs feeling shaky and weak. She gripped the side of the piano for support, then slowly let go. She walked to the center of the stage. She didn't bow with the theatrical flourish of a professional performer. She just stood there, clutching her cardigan closed, and offered a simple, deep curtsy. It was an old-fashioned gesture, awkward and imperfect. But the crowd roared again in approval. As she turned to walk off the stage, the applause didn't stop. It followed her like a protective cloud. As she hobbled toward the side curtain, the teenagers in the front row reached out. One girl, the one who had giggled earlier, held out a hand for a high five. Elena hesitated, surprised, but then she smiled, genuine. Toothy smile that lit up her tired face and gently tapped the girl's hand. The girl beamed at her as if she had touched a celebrity. Backstage. The atmosphere was completely different from when she had entered. The other performers, the dancers and singers, were gathered around. They didn't look at her with pity anymore. They looked at her with respect. A young girl with a guitar stepped forward and helped Elena steady herself. "It was amazing," the girl whispered, her eyes wide. "You were incredible." "Thank you," Elena whispered back, her voice raspy and dry. It felt strange to receive such praise from strangers, but it also felt healing. It was as if by sharing her pain through the music, she had lightened the load she had been carrying for 40 years. Once she was safely off the stage and away from the lights, a volunteer rushed over to help her to the back of the auditorium where Thomas was waiting. As she approached him, he reached out his frail hands. "You did it, Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper but filled with emotion. "You made me so proud." "I played for you," she said softly, kneeling beside his wheelchair and taking his hand. "And for Anna, I think she finally heard me." Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. "She always heard you. You just needed to hear yourself." Elena helped the volunteer push Thomas out to the car. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the heat of the stage lights. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Riverton, Elena looked out the window. The town looked the same streetlights, same houses, but she felt different. The invisible wall she had built around herself was gone. She wasn't just the old woman with the limp anymore. She was a pianist. She was a woman who had faced her fears and won. They arrived at the cottage. Elena helped Thomas inside and settled him into bed. He was exhausted but happy, drifting off to sleep almost immediately with a smile on his face. Elena walked through the quiet house to the sunroom. She walked past the old electronic keyboard without even glancing at it. She didn't need it anymore. She sat in her rocking chair by the window and looked up at the moon. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer trembling. They felt strong for the first time in years. She knew the arthritis would still be there in the morning. She knew her leg would still hurt. She knew she was still old. But none of that mattered anymore. She had reclaimed a piece of her soul that she thought was lost forever. The next day, the video of her performance was all over the internet. It had millions of views. People in the town stopped her at the grocery store to shake her hand or tell her how much her music had moved them. But the true victory wasn't the fame or the attention. It was the peace she felt inside. Alina continued to live her simple life in Riverton. She still wore her cardigans, and she still walked slowly. But now, when she walked down the street, she held her head high. She no longer looked at the ground. And occasionally, when she sat in her garden, she would hum the melody of the song that set her free, proving to herself and the world that it is never too late to let your light shine.